The stories. What happened inside this mountain lodge will shock you. The guest log from that mountain lodge still sits in a plastic evidence sleeve with one page glued to another. Dispatch records show a routine welfare check, then a second call minutes later that changed everything. In early October of 2011, Tegan Rourke was 33 and worked as a county building inspector. That morning, Tegan planned to recheck a roof repair on a remote lodge above a winding forest road. The lodge stayed open year-round, but the owner only kept staff there on busy weekends. Tegan had done permits there before, and the place always felt quiet but harmless. The weather was clear, and the drive up took just under 2 hours from the county offices downtown. Tegan's county truck climbed through pine stands and bare rock, and the radio kept fading in and out. A printed work order sat on the passenger seat, with a note about leaks over the dining hall. Tegan expected a quick walkthrough, a few photos, and a signature from whoever was on site. At the turnoff, the lodge sign leaned slightly, and the gravel lot had only one vehicle parked. It was an older SUV with an out-of-state plate, and its driver window was cracked open. Tegan noted it in a small notebook because parked vehicles mattered in a rural inspection log. The lodge itself was a long timber building with a stone chimney and tall windows facing the slope. Tegan knocked at the front doors and waited, then tried again with a little more force. No one answered, and the doors were locked, which was unusual during posted open hours. Tegan walked around to the side entrance near the kitchen, where staff usually came and went. That door was also locked, but the deadbolt was not fully seated, like it had been rushed. Tegan called the owner's number from the permit file, and it went to voicemail after 4 rings. A text message sent, then stayed unread, and Tegan felt the first small pinch of worry. County rules allowed an exterior inspection without entry, but the leak note required a look inside. Tegan radioed the office, reported no contact, and said a second attempt would be made shortly. Tegan moved under the eaves and checked the roof line from the ground with binoculars. The shingles looked new over one section, and a gutter joint had been patched with sloppy sealant. A faint drip line stained the siding, and Tegan snapped photos with a work phone. Then a sound came from inside, a single thud that carried through the front windows. Tegan froze, listening, and heard nothing else for several seconds after that heavy impact. The lodge sat too far from neighbors for casual foot traffic, and no wind moved the doors. Tegan tried the front doors again, and this time the right door shifted a half-inch. It had been locked before, but now the latch gave slightly, like something inside pressed against it. Tegan stepped back and decided not to force entry, because welfare checks were not the county job. Still, the odd shift in the door made leaving feel wrong, like ignoring a smoke smell. Tegan called the sheriff dispatch line and requested a deputy to check the building. The call log later showed Tegan used calm language, but the dispatcher noted concern about possible injury. While waiting, Tegan walked back toward the SUV to see if someone was nearby in the lot. The SUV keys were not visible, and the seats were empty, but a paper map lay open on the dash. A small badge clip hung from the rearview mirror, the kind used for conferences or guided tours. Tegan could not read the name through the glass, but the plastic sleeve looked freshly printed. Tegan stood by the county truck and watched the lodge windows, expecting movement in the curtains. Nothing shifted, and the silence started to feel staged, like a room waiting for a cue. A second thud came, softer this time, followed by a faint scrape that lasted 2 seconds. Tegan raised the phone to record audio, then stopped, unsure if that would help later. Deputy Marlowe Kincaid arrived about 20 minutes later, alone in a marked unit. Marlowe was 41 and had worked patrol in the county for 14 years. He greeted Tegan, took in the locked lodge and the lone SUV, and asked what happened so far. Tegan explained the door shift and the sounds, then handed over the permit file contact number. Marlowe tried the front entrance, found the same slight give, and tested the handle carefully. The door opened 2 inches, then stuck, as if something heavy pressed it from the other side. Marlowe called out, "Sheriff's office! Anyone inside?" and waited for an answer that never came. He motioned Tegan to stay back, then reached around the gap with a flashlight. The beam caught a strip of carpet near the threshold, darkened by something that looked wet. Marlowe's posture changed, and he pushed the door harder, but it still would not swing fully. He stepped aside, drew a small pry bar from his kit, and worked the latch without splintering wood. The door gave another few inches, and the smell hit them both, sharp and sour like old water and metal. Marlowe backed out and called dispatch again, requesting a second unit and medical standby. The dispatch log reportedly shows his tone shifted from routine to urgent within that sentence. He then circled to the kitchen door, found it partially unseated, and eased it open with his shoulder. That entrance opened cleanly, and the two of them stepped into a dim hallway lined with framed photos. The lodge was colder inside than it should have been, like the heat had been off for hours. A small radio played faintly in the kitchen, but the volume was low, almost like it was meant to hide. Marlowe followed the sound toward the dining hall, moving slow and keeping Tegan behind him. The floorboards creaked, and a hanging light swayed slightly, though no air seemed to move. At the dining hall doorway, something blocked the opening from the far side. It was a chair tipped on its side, wedged against the door like a crude barricade. Marlowe pushed it away with his boot, and the doorway cleared enough to see the room. The tables were set for breakfast, but no food sat out, and the place looked paused mid-routine. Near the fireplace, a man lay on his back with one arm bent under him at an awkward angle. He wore a lodge, staff polo, and his face had bruising around one eye, older than a few minutes. Marlowe checked for response from a safe distance, then moved in and felt for a pulse. The man was cold, and Marlowe looked down at the floor beside him, where dried streaks ran toward the entry. Tegan stood in the doorway, trying not to stare, and focused on small details to stay steady. A lodge keyring lay near the man's hand, and one key was snapped clean in half. A thin line of clear fishing wire ran from the chair at the doorway to a table leg. It was tied tight, and Tegan saw it only because the flashlight glare caught its sheen. Marlowe followed the wire with his eyes, then cut it with a pocket knife to remove tension. He told Tegan to step back into the hallway, and Tegan did without arguing. He radioed dispatch again, and his short words suggested a deceased person and a possible scene. The radio response crackled, and for a moment, Tegan could not understand any of it through the static. While waiting for backup, Marlowe did a slow sweep without touching anything else. He checked the front entrance from inside and found the reason it would not open. A heavy rolling cart from the kitchen had been shoved against it, with towels stuffed under its wheels. The cart was positioned with care, like someone wanted the door to move just enough to tempt entry. The lodge office sat behind the front desk, and Marlowe could see light under its door. He tested the knob, found it locked, then noticed a second strand of wire at ankle height. That wire ran from the office door handle to a wall hook, like a tension trap. He stepped over it and stayed clear, then called out again to announce his presence. No one answered from the office, but a printer clicked once, then hummed as if waking. The sound was small, yet it made Tegan's stomach tighten, because it implied someone had been there. Marlowe kept his weapon holstered and used a mirror tool to look around the door edge. He saw no movement, then waited, like he was giving a hidden person time to make a choice. Backup arrived, along with a medic unit that stopped short when the scene was explained. Deputy Arden Sola joined Marlowe, and together they secured the lodge and kept Tegan outside. Tegan sat on a stone bench by the entrance, hands on knees, watching steam rise from their breath. From that spot, Tegan noticed something odd about the SUV. The rear hatch was not fully latched. When Arden checked the SUV, she did not open it right away, but photographed the gap first. Inside the hatch, a duffel bag sat open with folders, a portable recorder, and extra badge clips. The badges all carried the lodge name, with a line that read, Guest Services Volunteer Weekend. None of the badges had a photo, only a blank square and a printed first name that looked generic. Arden set the bag aside as possible evidence and closed the hatch gently, leaving it for investigators. Detectives arrived later that afternoon, and the lodge became a sealed scene with tape and logs. Tegan gave a formal statement, repeating details, and was asked twice about the fishing wire. Tegan described where it was tied and how it caught the flashlight glare, and the detective wrote carefully. They also asked about the earlier thuds, and Tegan admitted the second scrape sounded like furniture moving. The detectives found another staff member in an upstairs room, alive but disoriented and dehydrated. She was named Lorna Vess, 36, and worked as a front desk clerk during weekends. Lorna reportedly said she had been locked in the room and her phone had been taken. She remembered arguing with someone she thought was a guest, then a sting in her neck, then darkness. In the office, investigators found a laptop open to a guest reservation list. Several names were typed in, then deleted, then typed again, like someone kept changing the plan. A printed sheet sat in the printer tray, warm to the touch, listing check-in times for people who never arrived. The times were spaced exactly 15 minutes apart, and each entry used the same handwriting style in the notes field. They also recovered an audio recorder under the front desk, still running when it was found. The file timestamp matched the morning of the welfare check, according to later reports. It captured faint footsteps, the scrape of a cart, and a voice whispering a phrase twice. The phrase was hard to make out, but analysts later suggested it sounded like, "Keep them outside." Tegan was asked to review photos of the dining hall layout from earlier permit visits. Tegan noticed the tables were arranged differently than normal, leaving clear paths between doorways. The fireplace tools had been moved to the far wall, neatly lined up like they were counted. A single chair sat facing the front desk, centered, as if someone wanted a person to sit there. It was the kind of staging that looked normal until someone pointed out how deliberate it was. The dead man was identified as a seasonal employee hired 3 weeks earlier. His employment file listed only a local mailing address and a prepaid phone number. Investigators could not confirm prior work references, and the ID copy looked unusually clean. The medical examiner later ruled the death a homicide caused by blunt force trauma and delayed help. The report noted older bruises, suggesting the man had been struck earlier, then moved. Lorna, once stabilized, gave more details in a second interview that detectives treated as key. She recalled a guest who arrived the night before, claiming the lodge needed a safety inspection. He wore a lanyard badge that looked official, and he spoke with confident, practiced calm. He asked where the security cameras recorded and whether the front doors could be opened from inside. When Lorna questioned the request, he smiled and said, "It's a drill. The owner knows." That line sounded harmless in the moment, but it became important once detectives checked the owner's story. The owner insisted no drill was planned and no outside safety contractor had been hired. Phone records showed the owner received missed calls, but none were returned until late afternoon. He also admitted he rarely checked the lodge on weekdays, and he trusted staff to handle small issues. That gap in oversight gave someone space to run a plan without interruption. The biggest break came from the guest services volunteer badges found in the SUV. A detective called the lodge booking vendor and asked about the volunteer weekend program. The vendor said no such event existed, and the lodge had never used that wording in promotions. The badge design, however, matched a template used by a nearby conference center. It was a generic print layout, the kind anyone could buy online and customize in minutes. Investigators then pulled archived security footage from a gas station down the mountain. The footage reportedly showed the older SUV arriving the previous evening, then leaving briefly, then returning. A man in a ball cap carried a rolling cart cover, like the ones used for banquet linens. He moved with familiarity, like he knew exactly what tools he needed and where to place them. He also wore a lanyard, and the badge swung forward once, showing a blank square where a photo belonged. The twist did not come from a hidden identity reveal, but from a detail Tegan almost dismissed. During the first statement, Tegan mentioned the front door shifting, as if something pressed it. A detective later asked Tegan to walk through that moment again, step by step, without guessing. Tegan realized the door shift happened after the first thud, not before, which meant timing mattered. It suggested someone moved the cart to create the tempting gap only after hearing Tegan outside. That led detectives back to the audio recorder under the front desk. They enhanced the section between the thud and the door shift, filtering out the radio static. A clearer sound emerged, the rolling squeak of rubber wheels, followed by a breathy whisper. The phrase was not "keep them outside" after all, it was "get them outside," repeated with urgency. It sounded like a command to someone else, not a reminder to self. From there, the theory shifted in a way that surprised even the investigators on the case. They had assumed a lone intruder staged traps to prevent entry, then escaped out a back route. Instead, the evidence pointed to two people, one inside controlling access, another upstairs managing Lorna. The dead employee likely resisted, got injured, and became a problem to move out of sight. The person at the front desk then tried to lure an outsider in, but keep them from seeing too much. The chair barricade and fishing wire were not meant to harm an intruder. They were meant to slow them down, trip them lightly, and force them to look at the floor. If someone stumbled, they would focus on their footing, not on the office door or the front desk area. The rolling cart at the front door was positioned to let the latch click, making it seem unlocked. That tiny invitation would draw a person to the wrong entrance, while the real exit stayed clear elsewhere. A second exit did exist, but it was not a secret tunnel or anything dramatic. It was the service stairwell that led to a ground-level storage door behind the lodge. That door had no alarm contact, because it was listed as an interior-only access in old plans. Tegan's permit photos from years earlier showed the door, but no one had updated the security list. The person who planned this had likely studied those plans or worked a similar building before. In the weeks that followed, the case did not end with a neat arrest and a televised confession. Investigators identified a suspect connected to a string of small frauds involving fake inspections. Witness statements placed him near the lodge, and a partial fingerprint matched on a badge clip. Still, the second person remained unknown, and no clear motive beyond control and deception was proven. Official statements used careful language, noting the investigation remained open and evidence was incomplete. Tegan returned to the county office and filed the inspection as incomplete, with notes that felt unreal. For months after, Tegan kept replaying the moment the door shifted, like the building itself breathed. It was not a ghost story, and no one claimed anything supernatural happened in that lodge. It was just a plan, built from small choices, simple tools, and a confidence that nobody would look closely. Tegan learned that the scariest part was how ordinary everything looked until the pattern appeared. The stories. Locals warned about this abandoned cabin for years. The cabin sat back in the pines, and locals kept warning newcomers to stay away from it. Those warnings sounded like small-town drama until a maintenance worker found fresh boot prints in the dust. Kellen Brody was 36 and worked for the county parks department as a trails and facilities technician. On a cool weekday in early fall, he planned to swap a rotted signpost near a service road. The task was simple: drive out, set the post, snap a photo for records, then head back. He had done the same loop dozens of times, and he expected a quiet morning again. The service road cut through dense trees, and the radio lost signal not far from the highway. Kellen parked near a locked gate, then carried tools and a new sign down the old spur. Half a mile in, the trees opened around a clearing that should have been empty and flat. Instead, a cabin sat there, weathered boards and a sagging roof like it had been dropped from another decade. The cabin was not on his route sheet, and it was not in the park asset list either. Kellen had heard of it because people complained about trespassers and late-night fires near the clearing. A clerk at the front desk had once rolled her eyes and called it the cabin story again. Kellen never cared, because his job was signs, gates, and broken benches, not local legends. He set the new signpost first, then took a quick photo with his work phone for the file. When he turned back toward the cabin, he saw something that pulled him off his schedule. A line of boot prints crossed the clearing, dark and crisp in pale dirt, heading straight to the front steps. The prints looked fresh, and the last rain had been 2 days earlier. Kellen told himself it could be hikers, but the cabin sat outside any marked trail network. He walked closer, scanning for trash, smoke, or anything that could start a brush fire. At the base of the steps, he noticed a second set of prints that ended and did not return. The ground was soft enough to hold detail, yet there was no matching path back to the tree line. The front door hung slightly open, and the gap looked too clean for a place that abandoned. Kellen stopped on the bottom step, then called out with the polite voice of a worker in public space. He said, "County maintenance, anybody in there?" No one answered, and the cabin gave back only a dull creak from settling wood. He should have backed out and called a ranger, yet the missing return prints felt wrong. Kellen stepped onto the porch, and the boards complained under his weight. Near the threshold, he saw a smear on the doorframe, like a hand brushed it while entering. The smear was dark, but it could have been mud, and he could not tell from the angle. Kellen pushed the door wider with his glove, then leaned inside without fully crossing the threshold. The air smelled old, like damp paper and stale smoke, but it was not the sharp stink of a new fire. Light slipped through cracks in the boards, and dust floated in thin lines across the room. On the floor, a scatter of dry leaves formed a rough arrow pointing toward the back wall. His eyes adjusted, and he saw why locals might warn people away even without a ghost story. A narrow trapdoor sat near the hearth, and its edges were scraped clean, as if opened often. Next to it was a coil of nylon rope, pale and newer than anything else in the cabin. Kellen felt a cold pinch in his stomach, because rope did not belong in a forgotten structure. He backed out, set his tools down, and pulled his phone from his vest pocket. The service bar was still empty, but he could record what he saw for the supervisor later. He took photos of the prints, the rope, and the trapdoor, keeping each frame steady and clear. Then he tried calling again, and the call failed before it could ring. Kellen did not want to go under the cabin alone, and he knew that was a hard rule. Still, he could not stop thinking about the second set of prints that ended at the steps. He decided to do one more thing that stayed on the safe side of his job. He would check around the outside for a second exit, then leave and drive for signal. He walked the cabin perimeter, watching his footing on loose stones and roots. Behind the structure, a shallow trench ran along the foundation, filled with needles and old cans. Halfway down the back wall, the trench deepened and something metal glinted under dirt. Kellen crouched, brushed aside debris, and found a small square vent with a modern latch. The vent was nearly hidden, and it looked recently cleaned, which made it stand out. He did not open it, but he photographed it, then marked the spot in his phone notes. He typed short lines, cabin clearing, fresh prints, rope by trapdoor, vent with latch. He added the time, because details mattered when someone later asked what he had seen. By the time he returned to the gate, the quiet felt heavier than it should. Kellen loaded his tools, started the truck, and drove until his phone picked up a weak bar. He called his supervisor, then the regional ranger office, and he left a careful message. He said there were signs of activity at an abandoned cabin, and he was not going back alone. An hour later, a ranger named Sloane Maris met him at the gate with a second vehicle. Sloane was in her 40s, practical, and tired in the way of people who cover too much territory. She listened without interrupting, then asked for the photos and Kellen's exact walking route. Kellen handed over the phone, and she studied the prints and rope with a tight jaw. Sloane said the cabin was outside the official park map, but it still sat on public land. She also said locals called it the Long Cedar Place, and complaints came in every few months. Most reports were bonfires, dumped furniture, and teens daring each other to stay overnight. She did not mention ghosts, and her tone made it clear she did not want that part. They walked back together, and Kellen felt better with another set of footsteps beside his own. At the clearing, Sloane took her own photos, then measured the prints with a small ruler card. She pointed out that the deep heel marks suggested someone carrying weight going in. Then she paused at the steps, and she made a quiet sound, like a breath caught. There were two sets of prints now, and one set overlapped Kellen's earlier path. The newer set was lighter, and it came from the opposite edge of the clearing. It went to the porch, then turned and vanished near the front door, just like the other set. Sloane stared at the ground, then looked up at the trees as if expecting movement. She told Kellen to stay back, and she drew her radio even though the signal was poor. She tried the channel anyway, then switched to a second frequency and got only static. Kellen watched her shoulders tense, and he knew she was thinking about someone still inside. She stepped onto the porch, called out, and got the same silence Kellen had heard. Sloane did not go straight to the trap door, and that choice surprised Kellen. Instead, she moved to the side wall, then crouched near a warped window frame. She slid a small camera wand through a gap, and her face tightened as she watched the screen. Kellen could not see the display, but he saw her swallow, then pull the camera back slowly. She said there was a second door inside, not an exterior door, but a door that should not exist. She said it looked like it led into the wall, and the edges looked recently painted. Kellen blinked, because paint in that cabin would be like a bright flag in a swamp. Sloane told him to keep his distance, then she stepped into the cabin at last. Kellen stayed on the porch, angled so he could see the doorway and still watch the clearing. Inside, Sloane moved with careful steps, and the cabin groaned under her boots. He heard her say, "Ranger office. Identify yourself if you're here." Then he heard a faint click, like a latch turning, followed by a low drag across wood. Sloane backed out fast, and her expression had changed from caution to certainty. She said, "Someone is in there, and they have a way out you don't see." She told Kellen to return to the gate and wait, but he did not want to leave her alone. Sloane considered him for a moment, then told him to watch the tree line and stay silent. They held their positions for several minutes, and the only sound was wind through needles. Kellen's eyes kept returning to the boot prints that ended without a return path. He tried to picture how a person could step onto the porch and then disappear. Then he noticed something he had missed earlier, a thin line in the dirt beside the steps. The line was straight, like the track of something dragged, and it ran toward the side of the cabin. Kellen pointed it out, and Sloane nodded without taking her eyes off the doorway. She whispered, "That's a cover being pulled. Prosit." She moved along the porch edge, then dropped to one knee near the foundation. Near the porch corner, she found a plywood panel sunk into the ground like a loose hatch. Its top was dusted with dirt, but the corners were clean, like hands had lifted it often. Sloane used her knife to pry it, then held still, listening before she raised it fully. A cold draft rose from the opening, carrying the damp smell of soil and old concrete. Sloane kept her voice level and loud, and she called down into the dark. She said, "This is a ranger. Come up slowly and show your hands." For a few seconds, nothing happened, and Kellen felt his pulse thump in his ears. Then a voice answered, shaky and young, "Please, don't let him come back." A teenage boy climbed out, maybe 16, thin, covered in dust, and shaking hard. He looked at Kellen like he was trying to decide if he was real. Sloane guided him away from the hatch, then asked where the other person was. The boy swallowed, then said, "He's inside, and he locks the wall door." Sloane moved fast after that, and she told Kellen to stay with the boy. Kellen sat the kid on a rock and gave him water from his bottle. The boy held it with both hands, and his fingers would not stop trembling. He said his name was Rafi, and he had been working odd jobs with a man from a nearby town. Rafi said the man promised cash for hauling scrap out of the cabin and cleaning the clearing. Rafi also said the man called it a storage place, and he acted like he owned it. When Rafi asked why the cabin was not on any map, the man told him not to worry. Then, the first time Rafi saw the trapdoor, he realized it was not just a cabin. Rafi said there was a basement room under the cabin, with shelves and sealed plastic tubs. He said there were old tools, canned food, and stacks of papers wrapped in trash bags. He also said there were cameras, not new ones, but working ones with a small monitor. The man watched that monitor, and he told Rafi the cabin was safer than anywhere else. Kellen asked, "Safer from what?" Rafi looked toward the cabin, then lowered his voice like the trees could listen. He said people used to come here to hide, and they never left clean. He added that locals warned about it, because strangers always seemed to vanish around it. Kellen did not want to push a frightened kid, but the details sounded too organized for trespassing. He asked how Rafi got out, and Rafi pointed to the hatch under the porch. He said the man showed it once, bragging about how nobody could follow footprints. He said there was a tunnel that ran into the hillside, then split behind a false wall inside. While they talked, Sloane returned, breathing hard, and she looked like she had seen enough. She said the cabin was rigged with simple alarms, fishing line, and bells in the dust. She said the wall door led to a narrow corridor, and it was built with newer lumber. The corridor ended at the vent Kellen found, and it opened into a shallow ravine under brush. Sloane said the man was gone, and the only sign was a fresh scrape in the corridor dust. She called for backup again, and this time the radio caught a weak signal. She gave coordinates in plain language and asked for deputies and a medic for the kid. Then she told Kellen they needed to document everything before weather or animals erased it. They did it step by step, slow enough to be boring, because boring kept mistakes away. Sloane recorded a short video on her body camera, narrating each feature they found. Kellen took still photos with timestamps, then saved copies to a separate work folder. They photographed the rope, the trapdoor, the false wall seam, and the hidden hatch track. Sloane asked Rafi to describe the basement, and she wrote it down word for word. She asked about the papers, the tubs, and the cameras, and whether any names appeared. Rafi said the papers had dates, mostly older, like 1980-something and 2002. He said there were maps with circles and receipts from hardware stores and burner phones without service. He also said he saw a stack of cassette tapes in a milk crate, all labeled with weekdays. Sloane took that seriously, because tapes meant recordings, and recordings meant evidence. She and Kellen entered together, and they kept their hands visible on camera the whole time. In the basement, they found the shelves Raffi described, and the monitor that still had a faint glow. The tubs were real, and the tapes were real, and the labels were written in careful block letters. They did not play the tapes there because they had to preserve the chain of custody. Still, Sloan photographed each label, and Kellen read them quietly as if they were fragile. Monday check-in, Tuesday check-in, Wednesday check-in, and so on, over and over. At the bottom of the crate was a single tape labeled Visitors with no date at all. There was also a binder, thick, with plastic sleeves holding printed pages. Kellen saw a page that looked like a call log, with times and short notes beside numbers. He saw phrases like gate open, truck passed, and lights in clearing, written without emotion. Sloan flipped to another page and found a list of names, but none were full names. They were nicknames like Skiff, Halo, and Brick, and each had a dollar amount beside it. Sloan said, "This is not a dare cabin." Kellen nodded, and he felt his mouth go dry as he looked at the tidy shelves. It felt like someone had been running a business, and the cabin was just the front. Raffi kept saying the man watched people, and those tapes made that claim feel more believable. When deputies finally arrived, the clearing filled with engines and voices, and the spell broke. Sloan briefed them, then handed over the tape crate and binder with careful signatures. A medic checked Raffi, and he did not have visible injuries beyond scrapes and dehydration. Raffi said he had been down there only overnight, but he thought it had been longer. Over the next week, Kellen got pulled into interviews and paperwork he never expected. He met with a county investigator who asked him to walk through every minute of his morning. He provided his photos, his notes, and his call attempts, and he signed statements twice. He also learned from Sloan that the cabin had a real history, and it was uglier than rumors. Reportedly, the cabin had belonged to a private hunting club decades earlier, then burned partially and was rebuilt. After that, it became a meeting spot for all kinds of people who wanted to avoid attention. An archive clerk found old complaints about shouting and headlights in the clearing dating back to 1996. There were also missing property reports, like tools and bikes, that clustered around the same months. The warnings locals gave were not supernatural, and they were not just about trespassing. They were about a place that made it easy to disappear for a night, or a week, or longer. The tunnel explained the missing footprints, and the false wall explained the vanishing act. What surprised everyone was how long the setup had lasted, and how calmly it was maintained. The twist came from the tapes, once they were reviewed in a controlled lab. According to the investigator, several tapes captured short conversations, not confessions, but transactions and threats. One tape, the visitor's tape, included a voice that matched a former county contractor. That contractor had worked on culverts and drainage years earlier, and he had access to equipment and permits. The case tightened when purchase records matched lumber and vent hardware to a job billed as erosion control. The hidden vent was installed under cover of that work, and it blended into real maintenance. It meant the cabin was not just an accident of history, it was updated with official-looking paperwork. That was why it stayed off radar, because it hid behind normal processes and boring invoices. Kellen kept thinking about the moment he saw the prints that did not return. He realized the warning was never about the cabin itself, it was about the system around it. A place can be rotten and still look ordinary, especially when someone keeps it swept. When he drove past the gate later, the clearing was empty again, and the cabin was finally boarded up. Raffi was placed with relatives, and his statement became a small hinge in a bigger investigation. Sloan kept her tone steady whenever Kellen asked how it ended, because cases like that rarely end clean. She did say the main suspect vanished before arrest, and that alone kept the locals uneasy. Still, the tunnel was sealed, the tapes were secured, and the cabin stopped being useful. Months later, Kellen replaced the signpost again, because weather never stops doing its own work. He stood at the edge of the clearing and listened to the ordinary forest sounds. The cabin looked smaller with boards across every opening, like a mouth forced shut. Kellen understood why people warned others for years, even if they never knew the exact reason. He walked back to his truck, and he did not glance over his shoulder this time. Some places earn their reputation the slow way, through patterns people notice without proof. This one earned it through careful planning and through a hidden door that erased footsteps. And for once, the warning finally matched the truth. even if the truth arrived late. The stories. You can't outrun winter on that mountain road. The dispatcher log said the call lasted 47 seconds, and then the line went dead without a word. By dawn, a county plow driver found the truck door open, the engine warm, and nobody in the seat. On a Monday in late January, Lark Tolland woke before sunrise in a rental cabin above a ski town. He was 36, and he worked as a claims field investigator for a regional insurance company. His job was simple: on paper, verify damage, take photos, and write reports that could survive court. That morning, he planned to inspect a fender bender and be back in town before the next storm. The road down the mountain was narrow and shaded, with old pines that kept the snow from melting. A blinking sign near the first switchback warned about whiteouts and sudden closures in winter weather. Lark had seen signs like that everywhere, but this one looked freshly bent, like someone hit it hard. He slowed anyway, because the sky had that pale look that meant snow could start at any moment. The claim file on his passenger seat was thin, almost too thin to justify the drive. A delivery van had allegedly slid into a guardrail 2 nights earlier, then limped to a turnout. The driver reported minor injuries and a dented quarter panel, then asked for a quick settlement. The location was vague, described only as mile marker 27, near a scenic overlook. He reached the overlook and found something that did not match a minor accident report. The guardrail was scraped clean of paint, and the snowbank behind it was packed with broken glass. A few feet away, a second set of tire tracks cut off the shoulder and dipped into the trees. Those tracks had been dusted over, but the grooves still showed through like bruises under skin. Lark parked, stepped out, and felt the cold clamp on his lungs in a way that stole patience. He took wide shots first, then moved closer, keeping his boots on the packed snow for traction. The glass pieces were green and thick, more like an older truck window than a modern van pane. He also saw a torn strip of reflective tape, the kind that came on utility trucks. He used a small ruler for scale and photographed everything, then recorded a quick voice memo. The timestamp on his phone read 9:14, and he noted the wind was picking up fast. He tried calling the number on the claim, but it went straight to voicemail without ringing. The mailbox greeting was generic, and it ended with a click that sounded oddly clipped. Back in the cab, he opened the claim photos the driver had submitted. They showed a clean dent, no shattered window, and no guardrail scrape that deep. The van in the pictures also had no reflective tape, and its plate was never visible. Lark felt the small itch of a file that was built to be paid quickly. He drove a short loop to find the mile marker again because the road numbers rarely lined up. Near a bend, he spotted a maintenance gate and a service road leading into the trees. A fresh powder layer covered it, but a faint pair of tracks ran straight through the snow. They looked like a heavier vehicle, wide stance and deep tread pattern. He turned onto the service road slowly, keeping his tires in the grooves to avoid getting stuck. The trees closed in, and the temperature dropped like he crossed an invisible line. After a quarter mile, he found a shallow ditch and a broken branch sprayed with dried mud. That mud was dark and gritty, like it came from a lower elevation where the ground was exposed. A few yards beyond the ditch, something metallic flashed under the snow. Lark knelt and brushed it clear with his glove, then froze when he saw what it was. It was a small radio microphone, the kind clipped to a uniform with a torn cord end. The push button was cracked, and the backplate had a number etched into it. He did not pocket it, because he had learned what that could look like later. He photographed it from every angle, then used a clean bag from his kit to cover it. He set a bright survey flag beside it, so he could return with someone official. Then he walked back to the truck, feeling the snow start to sting his cheeks. At the overlook again, a state trooper cruiser sat angled across the turnout. The trooper was a stocky man with tired eyes, and his name tag read Kincaid. He looked at Lark's company badge and asked why he was off the main road. Lark explained the claim, then mentioned the reflective tape and the radio microphone. Kincaid's face changed at the word microphone, like a door quietly closing. He asked Lark to wait, then spoke into his own radio with careful, clipped phrases. When he returned, he told Lark the area was restricted due to a missing person report. He did not give details, but his jaw tightened when the wind gusted. Lark offered to show his photos, and Kincaid hesitated before nodding once. Inside the cruiser, Lark scrolled through the images, pointing out the glass and tape. Kincaid stared at the green glass, then at the guardrail scrape, and swallowed hard. He asked if Lark had found anything else, and Lark mentioned the service road tracks. Kincaid told him to stay put, then drove off toward the service gate without lights. Lark watched the cruiser disappear, and the quiet that followed felt deliberate. A few minutes later, Lark's phone buzzed with an unknown number calling him again. He answered, and a man's voice said, "Turn around and go back to town." The voice was calm, almost bored, and it did not sound like law enforcement. Lark asked who it was, and the line went dead with the same clipped click. He called back, but the number did not connect, like it was never real. He sat still, hands on the wheel, listening to the wind push snow across the glass. He could have left, and nobody would blame him for staying in his lane. Instead, he opened the claim file again, looking for anything he had missed. The driver name was written as Holden Rusk, but the signature was a rough block scrawl. The listed employer was a courier firm, yet the policyholder was a private individual. He checked the vehicle identification number recorded in the report. It was missing a digit, and the typed font looked copied from another document. Lark felt a cold certainty settle in, because small mistakes like that were never accidents. Someone had wanted the file to move fast, and they had not expected a field visit. Snow began to fall in thicker flakes, and the sky flattened into a dull white ceiling. Lark decided to head to the sheriff's substation in town because the trooper had left him alone. On the way down, the road narrowed further, and the wind started to shove the truck sideways. He kept both hands tight, and he drove slow enough that impatience could not tempt him. Halfway down, he saw a pair of headlights in his mirror, closing the distance too quickly. A dark pickup rode his bumper, then flashed high beams twice like an impatient warning. Lark pulled to the right where he could, but the pickup did not pass. It stayed behind him, keeping the same tight gap like it was hurting him. At a wide bend, the pickup finally swung around, spraying slush onto his windshield. As it passed, Lark caught a glimpse of a ladder rack and a stripe of reflective tape. The tape was torn, with a jagged edge that matched the piece he photographed at the overlook. The pickup did not speed away. It slowed ahead, forcing Lark to brake. Lark's pulse thudded in his ears, but he kept the wheel straight and his eyes forward. He reached for his phone and started recording audio, keeping it low by his thigh. The pickup drifted toward the center line, blocking him from passing safely. Then its brake lights flared, and the truck came to a near stop in the snow. Lark honked once, and the sound died in the storm like it was swallowed. A door opened on the pickup, and a figure stepped out wearing a dark coat and a hood. The figure raised a hand, not waving, more like signaling him to stay where he was. Lark shifted into reverse slowly, because panic made bad decisions feel like good ones. The pickup's figure walked toward him, boots crunching, head lowered against the wind. Lark kept backing, inches at a time, watching the road edge in his side mirror. His tires started to slip on the packed snow, and the engine strained. He stopped reversing, because another foot would put him into the ditch. The figure reached his driver door and tapped the window with two knuckles. Lark did not roll it down, and he did not unlock the door. He held up his badge through the glass and said, "I'm going to the sheriff right now." The figure leaned close, and Lark saw a beard and a pale scar under one eye. The man said, "You don't want to be out here when the road closes." His voice was the same calm voice from the phone, and it carried like he was unbothered. Lark said, "Move your truck, or I'm calling this in as a threat." The man smiled once, and it looked practiced. Then he stepped back. He walked to the pickup and climbed in, and the truck rolled forward again. Lark followed at a safer distance, keeping the audio recording running. The pickup took the next turnout suddenly, then vanished into the trees. Lark did not follow, because the lesson was clear. Someone knew exactly where he was. In town, the sheriff's substation was warm and smelled like coffee and wet wool. A deputy with a tired face took his statement, then asked him to wait in the lobby. After 10 minutes, Sheriff Rel Marston came out, coat still dusted with snow. He was in his late 50s, and his eyes looked like they had missed too much sleep. Marston introduced himself and listened without interrupting, hands folded behind his back. Lark showed the photos, the claim file, and the audio clip of the bearded man's warning. Marston nodded slowly, then asked if Lark had shared the microphone find with anyone else. Lark said he only told Trooper Kincaid, and Marston's mouth tightened at the name. Marston stepped into an office and made 2 calls, speaking low and careful. When he returned, he said a plow operator had reported an abandoned utility truck up the mountain. The operator said the door was open, the engine was warm, and a radio mic was missing. That matched Lark's find, and it matched the green glass scattered near the guardrail. Marston said the missing person was a county road technician, last seen checking a sensor array. Lark asked why a road technician would be connected to an insurance claim. Marston replied that it might be a distraction, or it might be a way to move a vehicle quietly. He said dispatch had received a strange call the previous night from a payphone near the mountain lodge. The caller reported a crash location, then hung up before answering any follow-up questions. The report was logged, but the storm had delayed a response until morning. Marston asked Lark to forward the claim documents, and Lark did it from his email app. Then Marston asked for the unknown number that called him, and Lark gave it. A deputy ran it through their system, and it returned as an unassigned routing number. Marston said that could happen with certain internet calling tools, and his face stayed flat. By afternoon, the storm thickened, and the mountain road closed behind the plows. Lark stayed in town, because leaving would mean returning to the same road in worse weather. Marston offered him a spare desk, and Lark spent hours comparing times and photos. He zoomed in on the claim images, looking for reflections, signage, and anything that anchored location. In one picture, he noticed a faint sign edge behind the van, showing a shape of a pine logo. That logo matched the ski area, not the overlook, and the snowbanks were shaped differently. The van photos had been taken in a plowed lot, not on a mountain shoulder. It meant the crash never happened where the claim said it did. Lark pointed it out, and Marston asked his deputy to pull traffic camera footage from the town entrance. The footage was grainy, but it showed a dark pickup with a ladder rack entering town 2 nights earlier. It also showed a utility truck following behind, then turning toward the mountain road after midnight. 20 minutes later, the same pickup came back alone, moving fast and wobbling like it was overloaded. Marston stared at the screen and said, "That utility truck never came back down." The next day, weather cleared just enough for a search team to go up with snowmobiles. Lark went along as a civilian witness, staying behind the deputies and marked vehicles. Near the service gate, they found the ditch and the broken branch, just like Lark described. They also found drag marks leading downhill, as if something heavy had been pulled on a tarp. The marks ended near a culvert where the snow hit a dark opening under the road. A deputy shined a light inside, and the beam caught a flash of reflective tape. They crawled in carefully and found the missing county utility truck wedged at an angle. The windshield was shattered, and the passenger window was gone, matching the green glass outside. There was no body in the cab, but there was a flashlight, a notebook, and a torn jacket sleeve. The notebook was damp but readable, and it looked like field notes. It listed sensor readings and timestamps, and then a final line that made Marston go quiet. The last entry said, "Saw an unmarked truck by the sensor box, driver wearing a fake badge." It ended with the words, "Call dispatch now," and then the ink smeared like the pen slipped. Marston said the technician had likely interrupted a theft because those sensor boxes used copper wiring. Copper theft was common, and crews sometimes got targeted because they worked alone at odd hours. But the fake badge detail changed things because it suggested planning, not opportunistic stealing. Lark asked about Trooper Kincaid, and Marston hesitated before answering. Marston said Kincaid was on administrative leave pending an internal review. He said a witness had reported seeing a cruiser near the service road around the time of the crash. That witness also described the trooper speaking with a bearded man by a pickup with a ladder rack. Marston did not accuse anyone outright, but the tightness in his voice carried the implication. Back at the substation, Marston received a call from state investigators. They had traced the fake claim documents to a printer at a small office rental in a nearby city. The office had been rented under a false name, paid in cash, and emptied the day after the storm. But a trash bin behind the building held a crumpled page with a copied policy template. On that page was a scribbled note that matched the etched number on the radio microphone. The etched number turned out to be an inventory tag from the county road department. It meant someone had handled the microphone long enough to scratch it, then dropped it in the snow. Lark realized the microphone was not lost during the crash. It was removed on purpose. The person who called him had tried to push him off the mountain before he connected the pieces. The winter storm was not just weather, it was cover, and it arrived right on schedule. 2 weeks later, the technician was found alive in a remote hunting shed below the tree line. Reportedly, he had a concussion and frostbite, and he had been too confused to find the road. Searchers found him after a dog caught his scent near the creek, then led handlers uphill. He told investigators he remembered voices, a flashlight in his face, and someone saying, "No witnesses." He also remembered a radio crackle, then silence, as if the battery had been pulled. The case did not wrap neatly, and Lark never claimed it did. There were reports of arrests tied to theft rings, and there were rumors about internal misconduct. What stayed solid were the logs, the camera clips, and the small mismatches that started it all. A bent warning sign, glass the wrong color, and reflective tape that did not belong on a van. When Lark finally drove home, the mountain road was open and sunny, but he still gripped the wheel hard. He stopped once at the overlook and looked at the guardrail, now patched and repainted. It looked normal again, which was the point of winter. It erased the edges fast. But in his report, the photos stayed sharp, and the timestamps stayed honest. The stories. This tape explains the warning signs. The tape was logged into evidence on a Tuesday, and the label only said, "Warning signs, do not ignore." When people finally listened to it, a year of roadside deaths stopped looking random and started looking engineered. In late 2019, Dax Calder was 37 and worked as a county sign technician for Public Works. He spent most days replacing faded reflectors, straightening bent posts, and arguing with weathered bolts. That morning, he had one simple goal: confirm the new warning signs on a mountain bypass were correct. The bypass cut through pine forest and rocky slopes about 20 miles from a small river town. It was the kind of road locals used to avoid traffic, and tourists used when their GPS got stubborn. For months, there had been crash reports near mile marker 12, mostly at night and in clear weather. Dispatch logs described drivers swearing they followed the signs, right up until the road turned wrong. Dax parked his county truck by a gravel pull-off, then walked the shoulder with a clipboard. He counted chevrons, measured sign height, and checked that each post was seated firmly in packed dirt. Everything looked normal at first, and that bothered him more than anything strange ever could. If the road was dangerous, it should look dangerous, and it did not. The first warning sign was a standard yellow curve sign with an advisory speed. It was fresh, reflective, and aimed straight at the lane like it had been installed yesterday. Dax wrote down its placement, then stood behind it to check the bolts in the bracket. That was when he saw the backplate had a second set of holes, drilled clean and recent. He touched the metal and felt a faint grit, like someone had ground it and wiped it fast. County signs came from a warehouse, and nobody was supposed to drill new holes in the field. Dax took photos anyway, then noted the serial number stamped near the lower edge. The serial number did not match the shipment list he printed that morning. He drove farther and found the next sign, a narrow bridge warning near a shallow ravine. The bridge was not narrow, and the guardrails were modern and well-maintained. Dax checked his map and confirmed there was no bridge project scheduled for this road. He stared at the sign until his eyes started hunting for an explanation that was not there. A pickup came up behind him, slow and cautious, then stopped in the lane with hazards flashing. The driver rolled down the window and asked if the road was closed because the signs looked wrong. Dax said the road was open, and he asked what signs the driver had seen. The driver said, 2 detour arrows and a warning about a drop-off, and none of it made sense. Dax felt a tight heat in his chest because his clipboard showed no detour signs at all. He asked where the driver saw them, and the driver pointed back toward a turn he had already passed. Dax thanked him, then watched the pickup crawl away like the driver did not trust the pavement. When the truck disappeared, Dax walked to his county rig and called his supervisor. His supervisor was Renly Goss, early 50s, a practical manager who hated surprises. Renly answered on the second ring and sounded annoyed until Dax said, "Wrong signs," and "new drill holes." Renly told him to pull the signs if he could, and to document everything before touching anything. Dax agreed, then drove back toward the turn the pickup driver mentioned. The detour arrows were there, but they were not county issue, and they were not on proper posts. They were strapped to trees with metal banding angled to pull drivers toward a dirt service road. The service road dropped downhill into dense brush, then curved behind a ridge and disappeared. A small hand-painted board read "Bridge Out," and the letters looked fresh. Dax stood at the edge and watched a sedan approach, headlights bright in late afternoon shade. The driver slowed, saw the detour, and started to turn onto the service road without hesitation. Dax stepped into view and waved both arms, forcing the driver to stop hard. The driver rolled down the window and said, "The signs told me to go this way." Dax told the driver to stay on the paved bypass because the detour was not official. The driver looked embarrassed, then angry, and asked why the signs were there at all. Dax did not have an answer he could prove, so he said they were unauthorized and dangerous. The driver backed out carefully and left, and Dax felt his hands trembling afterward. He took photos of every arrow, every strap, and every bolt head. He also noticed something else. Each detour sign was placed just before a blind curve. Drivers had only a second to decide, and the detour looked like the safe choice. Dax recorded voice notes on his phone, then tried to send them, and the upload stalled. The bypass had patchy coverage, so he saved everything and drove to higher ground. From a ridge turnout, he finally got enough signal to send Renly a batch of photos. Renly called back immediately and told him to stop touching anything and wait for law enforcement. Dax said he would, but he did not like leaving the signs up even for an hour. A deputy arrived 40 minutes later, a lean woman named Tressa Mullaney, mid-30s. She listened, took her own photos, and called it in with a tone that turned serious fast. Tressa asked if Dax had seen anyone nearby, and Dax said only one pickup passing earlier. She nodded and said that matched witness statements from past crash calls. They removed the tree-strapped signs and loaded them into the deputy SUV. Under the painted board, they found a strip of reflective tape like a road crew used. Tressa said the county did not use that exact tape, and she sounded certain about it. Dax asked if this was connected to the crashes, and she said, "It looks like it could be." Renly told Dax to return to the yard and pull old installation records for the bypass. Dax spent the evening in a dusty office, flipping binders and scanning sign serial numbers. He found that 2 shipments had gone missing over the past year, both marked as minor losses. The lost notes said damaged in transit, which now felt like a lazy answer. The next day, Tressa met Dax in a small interview room at the sheriff office. She played him a clip from an archived 911 call from 2018. A shaken driver described a "bridge out" sign and a detour that led into darkness. The driver said he turned back in time, and he kept repeating that the signs looked official. Tressa also had crash scene photos from 2018 and 2019. In each case, responders found tire tracks on the same service road leading to the ravine. Some vehicles rolled, some hit trees, and one went far enough that it was hard to locate. The official reports blamed driver error because no one could confirm the signs. Dax stared at the photos and realized why the signs were never in evidence. The signs did not stay up long, and nobody thought to collect them until too late. Tressa said a volunteer firefighter once mentioned hearing a power tool at night. The firefighter never reported it because the sound faded and nothing seemed wrong then. Now that detail mattered, and the deputy wrote it down with a grim look. Dax tried to think like a technician, not like a person getting spooked. He made a map of where the fake signs had been placed, using his photos and GPS stamps. A pattern showed up fast. Each cluster was near a spot where a vehicle could not easily turn around. If a driver committed to the detour, they were trapped by narrow cuts and loose gravel. Tressa asked if county staff could have installed them, even by accident. Dax said county crews would not strap signs to trees with banding because it broke policy. He also said the drilled sign backs meant someone had access to real county panels. That did not prove anything alone, but it narrowed the pool of people who could do it. Renly gave Dax a copy of the warehouse key log because he trusted Dax more than paperwork. The log was half digital and half scribbled, and it looked sloppier than it should have. Dax compared times to the missing shipments and saw repeated entries by the same initials. Those initials belonged to a contract yard worker who only handled loading and trash. The worker was named Cale Rydell, early 40s, hired through a staffing agency. Cale had access to the sign racks at night because he swept the yard and locked gates. That alone was not enough. But the timeline kept lining up in ways that felt too clean. Tressa asked for Cale's address, and Renly refused, saying it needed proper process. That is when the tape entered the story, quietly and almost by accident. A retired dispatcher called the sheriff office and said she had saved an odd recording. She said it was not a 911 call, it was a voicemail left on a county line. The voicemail was from a man who sounded calm, describing a warning system with pride. The cassette-style tape was old because the dispatcher kept personal backups in the 90s. She had transferred it to a digital file years later, but still called it a tape out of habit. Tressa brought the audio to Dax because the voice mentioned signs, bolts, and the bypass. Dax listened with headphones and felt his stomach drop within the first minute. The man on the recording said, "Those warnings are the whole thing. They guide them where you want." He talked about reflective angles and placement, like someone explaining a craft. He mentioned using real county panels, because drivers trusted official metal more than wood boards. He said the best trap was one that looked like safety, and he laughed softly after that. Tressa paused the audio and asked if Dax recognized the voice. Dax did not want to guess, but he said it sounded like someone he had heard on yard radios. Renly sometimes used a gravelly voice when he joked, but this was not Renly. Dax asked where the tape came from, and Tressa said it was dated 1998. That date made no sense at first because the bypass was not completed until 2003. Then Dax remembered something. The service road was older, and it used to serve a quarry site. Old county plans showed the area marked as restricted during blasting operations. Back then, there were warning signs, and the public learned to obey them without question. Tressa and Dax went to the county archive room, a basement space that smelled like damp cardboard. They pulled microfilm and dusty maps, and they found a file labeled Quarry Access Control. Inside were notes about repeated trespass incidents and stolen equipment. A line item mentioned Deterrent Signage Program, approved for night visibility. The author name was not Renly. It was a previous supervisor who retired long ago. That supervisor had a son who worked briefly at the county yard, then left under a cloud. Dax found the son's name in an old staffing roster, and it matched Cale Rydell's legal name. Cale had changed his last name later, and the archive file still carried the older one. Tressa ran it up the chain and got a warrant for Cale's phone and storage unit. The unit was across town, behind a row of auto shops, and it looked ordinary from outside. Inside, deputies found stacks of sign blanks, reflective sheeting, and a crate of banding straps. They also found a portable drill press and a set of county serial stamps. Cale did not deny making signs, but he claimed he was building props for a film project. Tressa asked why the props matched the crash locations and why they used county serial formats. Cale shrugged and said people drove too fast, and they would crash anywhere. Then he said something that matched the tape, almost word for word. He said, "If they see a warning, they do what the warning says." That line hit the room like a cold slap because it was not a defense. It was a philosophy, and it sounded practiced, like he had repeated it for years. The payoff came when they compared the tape voice to a recorded jail call. The sheriff office had legal access to that call, and a voice analyst reported a strong match. It was not perfect science, but combined with the tools and the signs, it added weight. Tressa also found that Cale's father had been the quarry security contractor in 1998. That meant the tape was likely the father teaching the son, or the son learning early. Either way, it explained how the method existed before the bypass ever did. When the quarry shut down, the service road stayed, and the idea stayed with it. Then the bypass opened, and the trap finally had traffic. The case did not solve every crash with absolute certainty, and nobody promised it would. Some drivers were drunk, some were tired, and some made bad choices with no help from signs. Still, witness statements changed after the arrest because people finally trusted their own memory. Several said they saw a man at night moving calmly with a flashlight near the trees. The county replaced every warning sign on that stretch, using locked hardware and tracked serial scans. They also blocked the service road with boulders and steel posts, leaving only a narrow footpath. Dispatch logs showed a sharp drop in late-night crashes within weeks. The bypass became boring again, which was the best possible outcome. Dax kept a copy of the tape transcript in his work folder, even after the trial ended. He did not listen to it anymore because the laughter at the end stuck in his head. He only remembered the lesson. Signs were supposed to protect people, not steer them into danger. When he bolted a warning sign to a post, he checked it twice, then checked it again. The stories. What happened inside this roadside diner will shock you. The incident became a training story in 2 counties because the footage looked ordinary until the last minute. It happened at a roadside diner off a long desert highway, and nobody agreed on what they saw. Dorian Kessler was 37 and worked as a commercial refrigeration tech for grocery stores and small restaurants. On a Tuesday in late spring, he drove east through high desert to replace a failing walk-in cooler motor. He had a work order, a parts box, and a plan to be home before dark. The diner was the only open place for miles, so he stopped for coffee first. The building was low and sunburned, with a buzzing sign and a gravel lot full of dust. Inside, the air smelled like fryer oil and lemon cleaner, and the booths stuck to the skin. A waitress named Maris Sloan was on shift, and she looked tired but alert. Maris was 42 and worked nights and mornings because the diner never fully closed. Dorian ordered black coffee and eggs, then checked his phone for the address again. Maris slid the plate down and asked what brought him out so far. He said he fixed coolers, and he was there to keep someone from losing a whole freezer. She nodded like she had heard that story 100 times, then glanced toward the kitchen door. A cook called something he could not make out, and Maris answered without turning around. Dorian noticed a small camcorder behind the register, aimed at the dining room. The diner did not feel dangerous, but it felt watched in a way he could not explain. A man in a windbreaker sat at the counter and kept his hands in his pockets. 2 truckers shared a booth, and they spoke low like they did not want attention. Dorian ate fast, then went to pay, because he wanted to start work before heat rose. As he stood at the register, the power flickered once, and the lights dimmed for a second. The buzzing sign outside changed pitch, like the voltage dipped and snapped back. Maris frowned and tapped the register screen. Then the printer spit a blank slip. She sighed and said, "Not again. It did this yesterday, too." Dorian offered to look because voltage drops were his whole life. Maris led him through the swinging door into the kitchen, and the noise got louder at once. Fans rattled in a vent hood, and an old freezer clicked like a bad relay. The cook was a broad man named Keenan Rourke, and he looked about 50. Keenan said the back hallway light had been pulsing, and the storage cooler was warm. Dorian opened his parts box, then crouched by the breaker panel near the dish area. He checked the main feed with a tester, and the numbers jumped more than they should. The panel cover was newer than the rest of the kitchen, and the screws looked recently handled. Dorian asked when the panel was replaced, and Keenan shrugged without looking at him. Maris said the owner did it after a break-in back in 2019. Dorian noticed her eyes stayed on the hallway that led to the back offices. The hallway was narrow and dark, with a mop bucket halfway blocking the path. A door at the end had a keypad, which felt strange for a place this small. Dorian pointed at it, and Maris said it was the office and storage for payroll. She said the owner did not like people back there, not even staff. Dorian nodded and went back to the panel, but he kept thinking about that keypad. He traced the flicker to a loose neutral and a corroded lug, which was simple and annoying. While he tightened the connection, a muffled thump came from the back hallway. Keenan paused with a pan in his hands, and Maris held her breath for a beat. Dorian asked if someone was in the office, and Maris said, "It is probably the ice maker." The thump came again, and this time it sounded closer, like it was against the hallway wall. Dorian stood and wiped his hands, then said he would check the ice machine anyway. Maris stepped in front of him, and her voice stayed flat as she said no. Keenan kept his eyes down, but his jaw tightened like he was chewing a secret. Dorian took a step back, because the tension felt wrong for a loose wire. He said he would just finish the panel, then leave them to it. The lights steadied after his fix, and the kitchen fans settled into a smoother hum. Maris thanked him too quickly, then walked him back toward the dining room. As they passed the hallway, Dorian saw the keypad light blink, then go dark again. He also saw a thin strip of fresh paint along the doorframe, not matching the older walls. He filed it away as odd, then returned to the register to pay for his breakfast. The windbreaker man at the counter had turned to watch them, and his eyes looked red-rimmed. When Dorian set cash down, the man spoke softly, without turning fully around. He said, "You should not be back there. It is not safe." Dorian asked what he meant, and the man shook his head like he regretted speaking. Maris snapped, "He is leaving, and you are done talking in here." Dorian took his receipt, and the printer finally worked again, as if it waited for him. Outside, the heat hit his face, and the lot looked emptier than before. He walked to his van, and he noticed a second security camera under the eave. It was angled toward the back door, not the customers, which felt deliberate. He started the engine, then hesitated, because the warning from the counter stuck to him. Dorian drove around the building like he meant to find the service entrance for the cooler job. Behind the diner was a fenced area with stacked crates and a rusted shed. He saw the back door, and near it was a fresh set of tire tracks in soft dirt. The tracks were narrow and deep, like a small truck had backed up recently. He also saw a dent in the door, low and wide, like something heavy hit it. He told himself it was none of his business. Then he heard a short burst of sound. It was not a shout, more like a clipped yelp that cut off fast. Dorian killed the engine and listened, and the desert silence made the sound feel louder. He walked toward the fence line, staying near his van, and called out, "Everything okay?" No one answered, but he heard a faint scraping, like a chair dragged across concrete. Dorian pulled his phone and started recording, mostly to prove he was not imagining it. He walked closer to the back door, and he noticed a smell like bleach and warm metal. A small vent near the foundation blew air, and it carried that smell in short puffs. He leaned down and saw the vent screws were new, bright against dirty siding. Then the scraping stopped, and a hush fell so hard it felt staged. The back door opened a crack, and Maris looked out with her face set. She asked what he was doing, and her tone was sharp enough to cut. Dorian said he heard something and wanted to make sure nobody was hurt. Maris said, "You are not helping. You are making it worse." Before he could answer, the windbreaker man appeared behind her in the doorway shadow. The man held one finger to his lips, then pointed down toward the ground near Dorian. Dorian looked and saw a folded napkin stuck under a crate like it had been tossed. Maris did not notice, or pretended not to notice, and she started to close the door. Dorian stepped back and said he was leaving. Then he turned and picked up the napkin fast. He walked to his van without unfolding it, because he did not want them to see. Inside the van, he opened the napkin and found a short message in shaky block letters. It said, "Do not call the diner, call the highway dispatch." Below that, a second line said, "Ask about the tape from 2016. Dorian sat still for a moment, hearing his own breathing over the idling engine. He did not know what highway dispatch meant, but the fear in the handwriting was clear. He drove 2 miles down the road to a wide turnout, then parked behind a broken sign. He called the county non-emergency line, and the operator transferred him to highway dispatch. He told them he was near a diner and had a safety concern, and he asked about a tape. The dispatcher went quiet, then asked for the diner name and the nearest mile marker. Dorian gave what he could, and the dispatcher told him to stay put and keep the line open. Within 10 minutes, 2 highway patrol units rolled in, then a county deputy behind them. Dorian explained everything, including the flicker, the thumps, and the napkin message. He played the short recording from behind the diner, which captured the yelp and scraping. The deputy listened with a blank face, then asked if Dorian had entered the back hallway. Dorian said no, and the deputy nodded like that mattered more than anything else. The patrol sergeant told Dorian he did the right thing, but his tone sounded rehearsed. They asked him to write a statement, and they took the napkin in an evidence bag. Dorian watched them drive back toward the diner, lights off, moving like they wanted surprise. He stayed in his van as instructed, but he could see the diner sign from the turnout. The sign kept buzzing, and each buzz sounded like a warning he could not translate. A half hour later, the deputy called him back on the same number. The deputy said officers were speaking with staff, and there was no immediate threat found. Dorian asked about the message and the tape from 2016, and the deputy paused. He said, "That is old business, and it is not for you." Dorian asked if someone had written the napkin, and the deputy said no one claimed it. Dorian could have left it there, but the whole thing felt like a trap door opening under him. He drove home with his statement copy on the seat, and he did not tell anyone that night. 2 days later, he got a call from an unknown number, and a man spoke without greeting. The man said, "Stop looking. You got lucky, and luck runs out." Dorian asked who it was, but the line went dead before he got another word out. He did not stop looking. but he looked in ways that stayed inside the lines. He filed a public records request for dispatch logs tied to that mile marker and that date. He also searched old local news archives using the diner name and the year from the napkin. What he found was thin and careful, like someone trimmed the story down on purpose. There was a brief mention of a missing drifter, last seen near the highway in 2016. The article described a backpack found in a ditch and a witness who heard arguing near a diner. It did not name staff, and it did not mention any search of the building. Dorian found a second reference in a scanned weekly paper, and it was even shorter. It said the case was unresolved, and the lead detective had transferred out. No follow-up, no closure, and no reason why a random tech would be warned years later. Dorian remembered the camcorder behind the register, and he wondered who controlled that footage. He drove back in daylight on his next week off, choosing a busy lunch hour for cover. The diner looked the same, but a new handwritten sign said cash, only today. Dorian sat in a booth facing the register, and he watched the camera like it might blink. Maris served him without recognition, or she acted like she did not recognize him. A younger server named Lenka Pruitt refilled his coffee, and she seemed nervous in a different way. Lenka was 24 and worked part-time while taking community college classes in a nearby town. Dorian asked if the diner had been busy lately, and Lenka said it depended on who came in. He asked about the camera, and Lenka said the owner watched everything from home. Dorian asked who the owner was, and Lenka said everyone called him Mr. H. She said she never saw his full name on anything. Dorian asked to use the restroom. Then he walked past the hallway like it was an accident. The mop bucket was gone, but the keypad door was still there, clean and freshly painted. He listened with his ear near the wall, and he heard a low humming like a small motor. It was not like an ice machine. It was steadier, like a fan pulling air through a duct. Dorian backed away when Lenka appeared, and she asked if he was lost. He said he was fine. Then he slipped her a folded receipt with his number written on it. He told her to call if she ever felt unsafe, and he kept his voice calm. Lenka stared at the receipt, then tucked it into her apron without a word. Dorian returned to his booth and finished his food, then left cash and walked out. As he crossed the lot, the windbreaker man from before sat in a different car, watching him again. That night, Lenka texted Dorian from a new number, and she used short, careful sentences. She said the owner paid cash under the table and made staff sign weird policy sheets. She said the back office was off limits, and Maris got angry if anyone even joked about it. Lenka said the humming came and went, mostly at night, and the lights sometimes flickered. She also said Keenan never ate in the diner, and he kept his own food in a cooler outside. Dorian asked if Lenka could photograph the policy sheet, and she said she would try. The next day, she sent 2 blurry photos taken in a restroom mirror for privacy. The paper listed rules about phones, cameras, and talking to law enforcement without permission. One line said any contact with outside agencies had to be reported to management immediately. Dorian felt his stomach tighten because diners did not need rules like that. He took the photos to a friend who worked records at the county courthouse named Sutter Hale. Sutter was 45 and handled filing systems, and he knew which requests to avoid. Sutter said the policy sheet looked like something a private security firm might draft. He also said the diner property had changed hands through an LLC, with layers that hid names. Sutter found one older permit tied to a different business, and it mentioned structural ventilation work. The permit date was 2019, matching what Maris had said about the panel. Dorian asked if Sutter could find the contractor name, and Sutter did, after a long pause. The contractor was a small outfit that did industrial ducting for meat processing plants. That did not fit a diner unless someone needed strong airflow for something heavy. Dorian thought about the bleach smell and the fresh vent screws behind the building. He also remembered the tire tracks and the dent in the back door. Dorian went back to the turnout at night, parking where he could see the diner without being seen. He used a cheap directional microphone, the kind wildlife people used for bird calls. He did not point it at windows. He aimed it at the back lot and the vent area. For an hour, he heard normal sounds, trucks on the highway and wind over gravel. Then, near midnight, the humming began, and it rose into a deeper mechanical note. A vehicle backed into the rear lot, and its reverse beep cut through the desert. Dorian saw taillights, low and close together, like a delivery van with a trailer hitch. The back door opened, and two figures moved something large on a dolly. The shapes were hidden by shadows, but the dolly wheels squeaked in a steady rhythm. Dorian recorded the sound, then he watched the back door close, and the humming intensified. He did not call the diner, because the napkin message had been clear about that. He called highway dispatch again, and he told them a delivery was happening right now. This time the dispatcher asked if he was the man from last week, and Dorian said yes. The dispatcher said units were already staged, and Dorian felt cold hearing that. Within minutes, dark vehicles rolled off the highway without lights, then stopped behind the diner. Dorian could not see what happened behind the building, but he heard shouting carry across the flat land. He heard one sharp bang, then another, and he could not tell if they were doors or something worse. He heard a woman scream once, then a voice yelled, "On the ground, now!" After that, the sounds turned into radio chatter and short commands that blurred together. The diner sign kept buzzing, and it sounded almost cheerful against the chaos. The next day, local news reported a multi-agency inspection that uncovered code violations and an illegal operation. They did not say what the operation was, only that arrests were made and the property was seized. They showed daytime footage of the diner lot, with evidence tape and workers carrying boxes. They did not show the back hallway, and they did not mention any missing person investigation. Dorian read every article he could find, and none of them explained the humming or the vent work. Lenka texted once more, and her message was short and shaky. She said Maris and Keenan were gone, and nobody could reach them, and staff were told nothing. Lenka said officers asked about an old camcorder tape, and they looked angry when it was missing. She said the windbreaker man was not arrested, but he vanished before questions started. Dorian asked if Lenka was safe, and she said she was leaving town that day. A week later, Dorian got his public records request back, and most of it was denied. One page slipped through, likely by mistake, and it was a dispatch summary from 2016. It mentioned a call from a payphone near the diner, reporting a person locked in a storage room. The call ended abruptly, and officers arrived to find the payphone smashed and the diner closed early. The summary said the responding unit noted a new lock on the back hallway door. It also said the diner owner refused a search, claiming no probable cause. That line matched the keypad door, and it matched the way Maris blocked Dorian in the kitchen. The twist was not a secret tunnel or a monster, it was something more ordinary and uglier. Someone had learned that a diner could hide things in plain sight, using noise and grease as cover. The ventilation work was not for comfort, it was to move air through a space nobody could enter. The humming was not an ice maker, it was a fan system tied to that locked room. Dorian still did not know who wrote the napkin, but he believed the windbreaker man helped. Maybe he had been a witness in 2016, or maybe he had been trapped there too. Dorian also did not know where the missing tape went or what it showed in the last minute. He only knew the diner ran like a stage, and staff were cast into roles they could not quit. When the lights flickered, it was not only a bad wire, it was a warning that something was running. Months later, the building sat empty, and the sign was taken down, leaving a pale outline on the wall. Dorian drove past once and saw weeds pushing through the gravel, reclaiming the lot in slow motion. He thought about how normal the breakfast had tasted and how fast normal turned into threat. He thought about Lenka taking photos in a mirror, trying to help without getting caught. He thought about a payphone call that ended mid-sentence and how silence can be engineered. Dorian kept doing refrigeration work, and he kept his head down because that felt safest. When he stopped at roadside places, he looked for keypad doors and fresh paint on old walls. He listened for steady humming that did not match the size of the building. He never told the story like a hero because he did not feel like one. He just felt lucky that a folded napkin landed where he could see it.